sketch from the Lego illustration. I hope that gave it away. Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. It's a pretty significant story. It's really not matched very, very well with other parts of literature like you could find sometimes in other parts of Genesis, like the flood. Lots of people have flood stories. Lots of different cultures have flood stories. Not so much with the Tower of Babel, which makes it all the more interesting to see what is this about? What is God speaking with a story like this? And so Genesis 11 goes like this. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, there are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore the name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. This is all about a human ascent to heaven. It is the story of Babel in a nutshell. It is a human ascent to try to get to be where God is. And that's what the problem was as far as God was concerned, the manner in which they decided that this was a good idea. It has to do with God confusing them, and that was his judgment upon them. See, the Tower of Babel is a unified declaration of independence. And you have to read it that way because the way the story comes across. First off, they are in this place called Babel, which we just read actually last week is the same place that this man Nimrod was from. And Nimrod was not a good character at all. Babel is a place of rebellion, a place where people are trying to exalt themselves over God, to make a name for themselves, to be someone great, right? The mighty men of the Genesis that is constantly referring to in a very negative way. And also they're migrating to the east. That is that place over there in between the rivers, the Mesopotamian region, which is Iraq, right? And it's the Fertile Crescent. It's a place where when you look at history from all different history books and cultural studies, of course it's the Fertile Crescent. That's where civilization would take its deepest root. There's lots of water, lots of food, therefore lots of people, lots of cities. So it matches perfectly with what would make sense. But the scriptures aren't so concerned to give you just the economic and agricultural reasons why it happened to be here that civilization would take such a deep root. The scriptures are concerned to say, how does God view it all? What's the significance behind what was really happening there, aside from lots of people eating and having cities and being populous? The point he's making is God's perspective on looking down to see all of this, is he actually viewed it as rebellion. Which normally, if you were to just study any ancient history class, it would just be a statement of fact. This is the Sumerians, and these were the people from Elam, and these were the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and they did this, and they made agriculture, and somebody made a real good technological advancement here and did this. And from that perspective, we just look at it as history. But from God's perspective, the way it was done is what is important to him. The manner in which it was performed. And it was, as his interpretation is, something of rebellion. Something of a declaration of independence. For they all had one language. It says one lip, one language, one word. That is, the way they ordered their words, the syntax of their words, all matched. They could communicate with each other. And then, of course, the very words themselves. Cat meant cat, dog meant dog. right? They're able to actually associate with one another through language and communicate through the world. And it's working great, and they're feeling good about themselves. They can accomplish a lot of great things. Hey, let's make a tower. You know what? We're getting pretty good at building towers. Let's make one that goes to heaven. Right? And so the purpose behind them, they're united that they would make their bricks thoroughly. The goal is, of course, to make a city and a tower that will reach to heaven. And it is one cultural rebellion, and that's the phrase. It's not that they're just making culture. They're making culture in a way that is inherently rebellious. For the scriptures give the explicit reason of why they want to do this. And that is so that we would not be dispersed throughout the whole world. When God's cultural commandment, God's cultural mandate to them was, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Here they're saying, let's not fill the earth. Let's consolidate, live in a city, and make life as amenable and easy as possible. Think about the American church. That's the Great Commission. Yeah, but let's make life easy and amenable as possible. Go to all the world, preach the gospel, baptizing them, teaching them in the name of, baptizing them in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them all that I commanded you. I mean, you could meditate on that verse long enough, and eventually you will inconvenience yourself if you want to fulfill it to its greatest extent. And so maybe they weren't thinking, well, let's just make a city, because it is a lot better when we're all working together. But the commandment was, get out everywhere. Inconvenience yourself to obey my commission upon your life. And God said, that's rebellious. You guys are not obeying what I've called you to do. And so God does two things primarily. First, he mocks them. You have to read it that way. God, notice the language. The Lord came down. They're going to make a heaven. They're going to make a tower way, way up to the heavens. And the very next phrase is, God puts on his bifocals, and he gets way down low, and he's like, he has to go the whole way down to the earth just to see the thing. Do you catch the irony here? How it's coming across? God says, oh, they're trying to do something. Well, we better get down there and see what that cute little speck is. And he goes down, and he looks at this so-called tower to see this great city. And then there's another thing. God does something. He moves them. He confuses their language, and he forces them to disperse. Forces them to do the first thing, the only thing he ever wanted them to do from the very beginning of the first page, that it wasn't even until after Adam fell, God still said, now go try to keep doing what I told you to do. And then Cain and Abel, and then the flood, and after the flood, now God says, now go be fruitful and multiply. Then after the flood, they're like, hey, let's build a tower and stick together. And God's like, here's Chinese and here's Japanese, now get out of here. Right? Like it's constant. He's always trying to get them to do this one thing, which matches perfectly with the Great Commission. Do you see how this connects? That if your life isn't centered around the Great Commission, God might actually see it, for all the good you do, as just rebellion. So that is God's command. He's pushing them. And so the crossing of the boundary is what's truly rebellious. They're breaking boundaries. That is, they say, let us build a city that its tower might reach the heavens. The heavens is God's realm. Right? So they say it is an outrageous undertaking. You think about that and you think, this story is fanciful. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk. Like, should I take this story seriously? Do these people really think that they were going to try to build a tower to the heavens? I mean, what do they mean by that? Well, it actually really makes a lot of sense when you think of them as the ancient mind would interpret this, right? So it's clear that in Scripture there are multiple levels of heaven, right? And so we don't just make up these multiple levels now because now we've arrived at landing on the moon and we've got to outer space and we found out God's not there. As back in a time someone would actually say that and say, see, the Christian worldview, if you take it literally, is so silly, right? Not at all. Way before even we broke the atmosphere, Paul would say this. He would say, I went to the third heaven. In 2 Corinthians 12, he says that. I've been to the third heaven, which presupposes there's a 1 and a 2. The idea here is that in the ancient mind, there's multiple levels to heaven. That is, there's a first level of heaven where the birds fly, the atmosphere. Then there's a second level of heaven they spoke of, which is where the stars were, the moon and the sun. But then, as Paul was saying, there's a third type of heaven. That is the unseen realm. That is the place where God himself dwells in his immediate presence. not mediated by anything. For God's presence is here in this room now, no doubt. But there is a place called heaven where there is no mediation between you and the living God. That's why Hebrews would say it's a fearful thing to fall in the presence or the hands of a living God. This is the third heaven, right? And so the effort is viewed as profanity. It's impious. It's ridiculous to say, I will get to God. I on this earth with my own 2 feet am going to go there. That's crazy. That's why the story sounds so crazy. But it's the way we think of it in our minds that actually everyone thinks this way. If you really boil it down, everyone is tempted to think in such a way. First, it's a dishonor to God because it's first saying in an implicit way, I intend to deify myself. I think I can arrive to the gates of heaven. Right? And not only that, it's a dishonor to God for it's explicitly disobedient in what God gave them to do. For example, think of it this way. If you were to leave your front door, walk down your street, and go visit your neighbor, it's within your power. That's not going up to heaven or anything. You can do that. But you know what? You probably should knock on the front door. Even at that level, how impious, how rude would it be to barge into your neighbor's front door? The reality is, how about this? You go say, I'm going to go to the White House and visit the president. You physically have the possibility of walking through the White House doors. But it's absolutely impious. It is so irreverent, so obtuse to think you could just barge right through. And now here, they say, let's kick in the doors of heaven. And let's find God on his throne. How absurd when you wouldn't even do that with your own neighbor. Do you catch what's going on here? Do you see what's being said? They're trying to make a name for themselves. To have authority over something or someone is, in a sense, to make a name. Adam and Eve. Adam, as a husband, has some type of headship where he gets to name his wife Eve. Right? Adam is able to name the animals. He's over the animals. Parents get to name their children. But no one gets to just name themselves. We live in a culture where that is exactly what we pride ourselves in. That we would say, and the implicit reality behind that is saying, I can name myself, that is, I have authority over myself. Authority over myself, I am autonomous. I am self-governing in the bad sense of the word. Not in the sense that you have great self-control, but in the sense that you are unto yourself. You are your own God. That is when you get to the point of trying to name yourself in the biblical definition of the word is absolutely ridiculous. And so the way the ancients would try this, and the way they did in Babylon, was through the way of the ziggurat, right? That very big tower with lots of steps on the side. And they would try to do this. And when you read what the Babylonians thought of when they spoke about a ziggurat, is they weren't so foolish as to think, I'm just going to build a tower that's going to be so high, I'm finally going to get to God. Like, I'm literally just going to climb this tower and find God up there. No, not at all. Like, the way they spoke of their ziggurats, when you read their literature, they actually interpret it first as maybe getting so high that they could get to the place where the birds fly, somewhere in the atmosphere. A really great building that everyone's going to be like, wow, the Babylonians have arrived. Look at their culture. They're nothing compared to the Hittites or whatever. Look at the Babylonians. But the way they spoke about it in the spiritual sense, what their mind was about the issue, is they viewed it as a palace, a temple for God, and that they spoke of it as the bottoms of their ziggurat reaching down into Hades, the underworld. And they viewed the very top of it as spiritually projecting into the heavenly realms, the places where God was. So the point was, they would think, I'm going to get up on that mountain, and I'm going to worship God or the gods, do my sacrifices and my things, and in a real spiritual transaction, God is going to hear me, he is going to see me, and real things are going to happen in the heavenly places. So that's really how they viewed it. They were transversing into some spiritual third heaven. And then what's amazing about it, at the very top is where they had this sanctuary. They also had a lot of couches up there probably, and a lot of women, which matches perfectly with what we read about the sons of the women and the gods and the sexual things that would happen there. You see how this all fits together like a glove? Now here's the thing. That's how they viewed it. And here's the words of how God describes a temple. He says this in Psalm 99. He tells Israel, "Exalt the Lord, Israel, you worship at his footstool." The idea was that their temple was not the house where God dwelled. It was the place where God put his feet. That is, God is, never forget this, Israel, not the rest of the world, that God is so transcendent, dare you ever think you could entertain him by building something for him to dwell in? No. Your temple will never be thought of in a Babylonian way. Your temple is simply where God will rest his feet. There's a place in Isaiah 66 where he says, "Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you could possibly build for me with your Legos?" Do you see? God rejects that picture entirely. And he says, this is child's play. You are silly, absolutely silly. And so that is what's going on here. It's the present condition. The fact is that we have broken God's boundaries because we think we're made in the image of God and we can get that high. For all people are made in the image of God. And that's a tremendous honor, a privilege. It's a crown upon the humanity, our head. And the way in which people interpret that, though, is it produces a sense of self-governing pride and autonomy. That is exactly at the root of what's going on with this ziggurat. And here's the thing. Everybody talks and everybody worships. You realize that. When you go to you look at a beaver dam, and that same beaver dam, that's how beavers have been making that dam for a lot of years. But if you look at our hydroelectric dams now, how come we make better dams than beavers? We have a tremendous rational ability that even though God has given the creatures an amazing thing to do, we are always inventing, always doing more. And there's something about our speech. Do you see why Babel is about speech? Something about our speech which reveals our mind, which is that we are so much more logical, so much more intelligent, and also something we do that animals don't do. We worship. You don't find a beaver shrine of ziggurats out there. Like, it's funny to think, but you ever just ask yourself that question? Why don't animals worship? And why don't they talk as well as us? And how come both those things are here in Babel? Worshipping false gods and language. It's interesting. It's the monument towers the human effort to attain to God. Think of this. When you think of now, maybe it's not ziggurats, but we have so many religions, right? There is Islam, which is this. Think of it as ascending stairs. First off, all cultures have language, but then if you actually think of who are the neighbors to the Babylonians? Egypt. What did Egypt have? These real big man-made mountains called pyramids. Well, that's interesting. And then you go to the other side of the world. What do you have with the Mayans? These real big man-made mountains with stairs on the side. And the Aztecs, these real big man-made mountains with stairs on the side. And you think, how amazing. There's a unity. Everybody has to worship. And it's something about this mountain of trying to get to God. Everybody's trying to get to God. And even though the languages would be different, the culture would be different, the opposite side of the globe, they still thought it was a good idea to build a mountain to get to God in Mexico, not in Iraq. Because there's a unity here that the Babylonian story is showing us, that everybody's trying to get to God, and they're trying to build stairs. See, here it is with Islam. The fact is that Islam sees it this way. You must be perfectly submitted to Allah. You must. You have to do all the good works. And you know what? Even then, you don't know for sure if Allah could be merciful to you. There's actually a part where Muhammad himself says he didn't even know if he was going to receive mercy from Allah. Right? But the idea is, behind all that theology is, don't stop trying. Don't stop working. Keep doing everything you can. And you know what? There's a part where it says, even if you were to give yourself to martyrdom, to jihad, then your chances are really good. If you really, really would even give your own body away, Allah might be favorable to you. Hinduism. You need to find that secret knowledge. You need to get high up into the heavens to get it. Sin isn't an ethical thing. It's not sin against God. In Hinduism, sin is simply just ignorance. You just don't know. You're not enlightened. So what you have to do, well, there's this thing called the path of devotion, and it is a staircase. And there's this thing called the path of knowledge, where you have to get more. You have to better yourself. You have to arrive, and then you will have enlightenment, and you'll know everything. You'll get to heaven. You'll find the gates. Then there's this other one called Buddhism, which they're even more explicit. They literally call it the Eightfold Path. These literally could be 8 labels on stairs up the side of your ziggurat. That you will get to God this way. First, you find the 4 Noble Truths. You'll rid yourself of impure thoughts. You'll do right speech, right conduct. Number 4, simple living. Work to detach yourself from the world. Stop doing everything, and maybe you could be the enlightened one. And then understand the very nature of yourself, whatever that might mean. And then finally, if you can really arrive to the very top of the mountain and get to God by your own strength and virtue and wisdom, then you can give yourself 100% to the enlightened. And then you transverse into this karma. Right? Do you realize that, no, maybe we're not building ziggurats anymore, but the mind of everyone is, I can do this. I can save myself. I can tap on the gates of heaven. And this is the very thing that this story is critiquing. The reality is to distinguish myself, to make a name for myself by doing these things, and God finds a barrier at his heaven every time, and it is confusion. It is confusion. That's how God decided to do it. Why was it language? Like, he could have frustrated this effort in so many different ways. What was it the story is trying to say about human language? Because the fact is, we're all made in the image of God. It's a unique human dignity. Psalm 8 says that we're above all the animals. He's given dominion over us, that all the works of our hands, and that he's put all things under our feet. There's something about human being an image bearer of God. And then he says this, that there's this image bearing of God that makes us something like God. There's a point of contact. You think of that real famous picture by Michelangelo, right? And that's the one where there's God and there's man, and the fingers are almost touching. You know, that's the temptation to see we are something like him. We do bear his image, and there's a closeness to him that we can know something about God that's beautiful and unique to us as humanity. We can communicate with him. We can commune with him. Through our language, we can worship him. This is a beautiful thing. Look at this. Genesis 1:27. This is the part where God says, I made you in my image. God created man out of his own image. In the image of God, he created a male and female. He created them. And then it says this. God blessed them, and God said to them. And then at that moment, God enters into dialogue with man. I made you in my image. Now let me talk to you. It's amazing. He doesn't talk to the other animals. He doesn't talk to the trees. But he talks to Adam right after he made him in his image. There's something beautiful about human language, and it belies the beauty of the wisdom of God to see it that way. The image of God is found in language because language is its bridge. That is, God gives language so that we would have communication with him, so that we would love him and worship him. That's why language and worship are so closely connected. That literally is our bridge to say, God, I love you. And guess what? Why are Christians all about the book? Do we just like books? Are we bookish people? No. No, it's because God speaks words. And so do we. That's why words are so important. For it is the pathway in which God has chosen to be worshipped and to make himself known, so that we would see his glory and that we would be awestruck by his beauty. And language is the bridge. And so they tried to make a bridge themselves, and God broke the bridge. They made a bridge on their own terms, and he broke it immediately to show the frustration of their efforts and their weaknesses. The confusion that came upon them was God's judgment. It falls upon them because God is a God of light, and God is a God of darkness. That is, God can give information and he can take it away. He made the world. In the beginning, there was darkness over the surface of the deep. And there's this chaotic water, and it has no order, it has no sense. And God speaks his word into it, and it takes form, he sets boundaries and structure to the whole thing. And then he puts us in the place. And so all this world is based on the structure of God's word. And so therefore God goes to them and says, I'm going to destructure your word so that you see that you are not God. You do not have that kind of power or authority with your word. There's no way you could speak that way. See, he confuses their language because language is grounded in all of our rationality. This is the most amazing thing to me. When you actually think about how language works, when you actually think about how it really works, people about 100 years ago in Europe studied language a lot, and they just thought maybe they could figure something out by doing it. And really all they did, for me personally, is just see the beauty of God in language. Like the absolute beauty of logic and rationality that's grounded in God. Because language has a deeper thing. It's the logical structures of the mind. So the whole point of confusing a language is you can have someone in Spanish, French, and English, right? They all are speaking entirely different things, but they're all using the same structure. That is, they're all using nouns and verbs and actions, and they may change the order of the words a little bit, but that structure is fundamental. That structure is the logic of God that's written into us as we bear his image. And the perfect example of this is the arbitrariness of a name game. For example, you could say the word of God created the heavens. Now here's the thing, God created light. He didn't just name it light. He created land. He didn't just say, this stuff over here is called land. He created with his word animals. He didn't just name the animals. See, his word had creative effect, right? But then the beauty of it, why Adam in God's image? Why Adam talking to God? So God could say this, Adam, what do you want to call this one? What do you want to call this animal? Effectively saying, Adam, I don't care what you call him. You can label him anything you want. Your words have no power here. I created the nature of that bear. Now you could call it a Zimzu, whatever you want to call it. Do you see how language is working there before the Tower of Babel? I'm inviting you, Adam, to do this. Talk with me. Talk with me. Let's do this. Like a child, teaching a child the words from toys. So Adam's language is for the purpose of communion with God, not for the purpose to have power like God. Adam's language has no power here. But the very thing they're doing here when they're building this big mountain is they're trying to get that power. So God's reminding them, don't you know what your language is for? You can't do anything. Here's Chinese. Good luck with that one, right? Babel shows that. Here's an example. The Hebrew word for fish is dog. All right? It's arbitrary, absolutely arbitrary. What do you want to call this? What do you want to call that? And the whole point is God's showing them that they are arbitrary, that their language means nothing, that they don't shape the world. And so the reality is when people, and God made this a principle, that when people actually get to this level where you want to rebel against God, you want to get that high, then he makes confusion. Now think of this for our culture. Think of this for our culture. There's a place where you actually want to say, I will define myself. I will give myself a name. And it won't be Sally or Tom. I am going to define my nature. I'm a man. I'm a woman. My chromosomes say this. My nature says this. But I am master of my soul. I define myself. There is no God. There is no one higher than me. Therefore, a culture that is that far gone, a culture that is to that level of rebellion, these actually seem like viable options. I can actually say this. I can say who I am. But you can't. You can't do anything, let alone make a tower to reach heaven. But our culture has reached that point in the ziggurat. We are up high enough that now the language is getting jumbled. Yes is no and no is yes. Boy is girl and girl is boy. We're too high. We need to humble ourselves and come off that mountain. Because the whole point of the principle of God's judgment is when autonomous human reasoning rises to that level, you better expect confusion. And we see it so much more than even only a few years ago. And here it came through the confusion of language. And I say all that with this. People who struggle with that should be loved by the church and cared for. That is a real mental problem. but there's no love in continuing a lie. God wouldn't have it that way. But that is a principle that we can see clearly today. That God has made boundaries. If you would try to come here, try to take my throne, you will be confused. You will be out of your mind. That is God's principle. To try to break the gates, the boundaries of God, brings confusion. For example, here is a great play on words. A great play on words that God's pointing out here. The Akkadian word for Babel means gate of God. Is that the definitive word? The Hebrew word for Babel means confusion. God is playing with their words and saying, you come to my gate, you look at that gate, and you look at your autonomy, and you think you're going to define it as that's my gate to God. And God, with the authoritative word, who speaks the heavens into existence out of nothing, says if you were to come on those terms, I will define what that is for you, and it's just pure confusion. It's a play on words about a story, about language, and how it's all jumbled up. Do you see what he's saying and how that plays out for our lives? And amidst such confusion, here is the beauty of the gospel. The beauty of the gospel in Jesus, the face of Jesus Christ, is this, that in John 1:1, it sounds like Genesis almost. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. John's saying, there is no reason to be confused anymore. There is no excuse for being confused. God has spoken a clear and crisp word. It's more than just sound waves. It's flesh and blood. He has broken from the gates of heaven and come down to earth. You cannot get there, he's saying, but I will come to you. And if you will come to me on these terms, you will find everything to make sense. The word there for word is logos. So we get the word logic. It's all going to make sense. Come to Jesus. He made it all. He can describe it from the beginning to the end. He can tell you what it all means. All you can do is play word games, slap labels on things that don't reflect reality. But the one who made all reality is called the Word, Jesus Christ. And to come to him through the gospel is to have everything make sense of your mind and the way the world is made. And there is the only way it could happen is if he were to come to us. Hence the difference from Christianity and all major religions and human efforts and philosophies of men. All other ziggurats could never do this. That God must come to me. I am the one in need. I am the one that is weak. And Jesus himself would say, no one has ascended to heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man, referring to himself. And that is it. That is the only way that we could ever have a good name, to make a name for ourselves. And I close with this, to ask this question for us to think about. What is your name? These people did this to make a name for themselves. So he decided to build a city. So he built a city, and you know what? He wanted to make a name for himself, so he made a name for himself through his son, and he named that city Enoch, after his son. And then you know what? Seth had a son, and his son's name was Enoch. Now to compare that Enoch, this Enoch did not try to ascend to heaven, but he walked with God. And God took him, really took him to heaven. And he didn't try to make a name for himself, but he gets the best name of anyone in the Bible. Enoch, the man who walked with God. Not many people in Scripture get that appellation. What name will you have for your life? What name do you want to define you? At your eulogy, what is it that they will keep saying over and over again? The one thing that's constantly repeated, that characterizes your life, the style of your life. He was always really good with money. That's great. He was very good with fixing cars. That's a good thing to say. She always wore the prettiest dresses. She was so sweet and friendly and laughed a lot. Those are great things. They should be said. But what's the thing that everyone says every time at your eulogy? What's the one thing that they would always be saying, no matter who met you? Would it be something like, He walked with the Lord. He knew God. Or when she spoke in such a way it sounded as though God were speaking to me. She had a godliness about her that was different from other people. Would you want a name like that? That's the name that's offered to us. And there's only one way, to walk with him. See, Amos says it this way. This is what God's required of us. This is what he's required of us. Oh man, what is good? What does the Lord require of you? Just to do justice, love, kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Walk humbly with, but no one would know me. Maybe only a few people, my family and some friends and some guys at church might know me, but I won't be famous. No one, if I just walk humbly with my God. It's tempting to walk away from that, to say, I want more. I want to make a name for myself in some way. And then the beautiful promise of Revelation is this. Jesus says, for him who overcomes, I will give him a new name written in stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. Do you realize what that means? God sees your life from the beginning to the end. He knows everything you do. And he sees you grow in godliness. He sees the good things you might do, the love you have for other people. He sees your struggles, your trials, your depressions, your anxieties. People just know you as so-and-so at work, or people just know you in daily life, or your character, or your position. No one knows your real name, if your name is really defined by your essence. But God knows that. And he can give you a stone, and it's all worth it for this, is that there's a name he has for you that he can give you, and it is worth it. It takes away all the temptation of vainglory. Why? Because God himself knows my name. He knows my whole life, and it was all worth it. I walked this world for him, for no one else, for no other name, for no other title. And I love him, and he revealed himself to me, and he has a name for me that only him and I know. That is how Enoch walked. And God took him. He ascended the hill of the Lord, not because he walked the hill of the Lord. He ascended the hill of the Lord because he walked with God humbly on the earth. Let's pray. Dear Father, I thank you for your grace, Lord, to us. This is just beautiful, Father. It is the wisdom of God and not of man. There is no other wisdom that works this way, that we would say inherently we are unable. We cannot attain. We need your mercy. We need your grace. Lord, I pray that you would give that grace to us more and more each day as we walk with you humbly.